Good evening, folks, and welcome to the Safe Ed for All show, episode 5. And tonight we're going to consider the effects of an airborne virus and what it can have on the school environment, particularly if, as for many school buildings around the country, air circulation is an issue. I remember when I was at school, we had windows that didn't open. In some classrooms, they were nailed shut. Ventilation was non-existent. The only air circulation came from rather asthmatic fans at the back of the class, if you were lucky to have one of them. Now you might ask, what relevance has that got to today then? And well, that school building, still in that condition, was still being used up until 2 years ago as my own children were going there. For many children, school buildings like this are still the norm, the reality, and sadly such environments really do help COVID-19 to establish itself. My guests tonight from Safe Ed are regular Sarah Saul and Claire Kosler, and I'm also joined by special guest Andrew Hobbs, who is a ventilation and indoor air quality solution provider. Welcome one and all. How are you all?
All good, thank you.
I'm good too. Nice to see you all.
Fantastic. Good evening. Sarah and Claire, first off, I might come to you. It's the beginning of the show, so usually we ask if there's been a Safe Ed update. I understand you had a first meeting of the Hive Live. Would you like to tell us about that and what happened?
We did last night. We had a few technical problems, I have to say, but it was our first one. And if anything, it just proves just how grassroots we are, that we're not some kind of slick media machine and not able to do everything we dream of doing. But it went quite well. We got some very interesting questions from the public. And Claire also appeared to ask a question. She was there as our backup because she knows some of the questions that she's been asked by parents as a founder of Safe Ed, and she's been supporting a lot of parents who are asking these questions. So that was really helpful. People who didn't feel confident asking the questions themselves had filed through, and some to Claire as well. It went quite well. There were lots of questions. A university student, CV, saying she's been directed to go back into her uni with no mitigations in place, asking for advice, what can she do? We were happy to give some practical first steps and refer people to other agencies and other places where they can get more information. We were joined obviously by Emmy, who's another founder of the Hive, and got a chance to explain what the Hive is. And just for those of you who don't know, the Hive is an umbrella. How can we say, it's amplifying the voices of the grassroots groups. At the minute, there's lots of small grassroots groups that are trying to get these messages out, that are being ignored by the media, that are being ignored by the powers that be, that are being refused to have meetings with certain people. You know, we've talked before about Kate Green. The invitation is always open, Kate. If you want to give your opinion on what classrooms should be doing, feel free. Come and talk to us. We're happy to have you here. You know, we've been pushing for, can we have some opposition to what is happening in schools? So more than willing to listen to anybody who would like to come on from opposition parties who would like to discuss that. So it went quite well, all in all. It's been viewed quite a lot already. So I will send you the link demo and you can put it out as well.
We will put it out as well. How did you find things, Claire? Was it good for you as well? You were there?
It was good for me as well. I'd had a bit of a sort of not well day, so I couldn't be quite as participatory as I'd have liked, but I was on there and I was asking questions. Like I said, I asked some of the questions that some of the parents didn't want to come on and ask because they were too shy. And as Sarah said, there was a university student who was highlighting going back to uni with no mitigations, but we also highlighted that there are some institutions that are putting good practice into place and sort of signposted them to look at the guidelines of those institutions to see where they can get ideas. And we were just chatting about, you know, who parents can contact. You know, some parents have never come across problems with authority. I mean, most of it's like most of us, we are not your typical school refusers, because we're not school refusers. Under normal circumstances, our children will be at school, and it's where to start. Who do you talk to? Start off with the school governors, you know, go through to maybe councillors, MPs, you know, just running them through the process of how they begin to argue back as well. And again, dealing the fact that we're there to support them if necessary.
Yeah, please do provide that link. It's not just about parents who are worried about sending their children back. There's all manner of reasons why people may be concerned about this, their own health. It's not just education either, because everybody wants to see their children educated well, but they want it done safely. And safety is the operative name of the game. And on that note, I shall turn to our special guest this evening, Andrew Hobbs. Thank you very much for making time to join us tonight. Over the past several shows, we've brought up the topic of HEPA filters. We've also discussed the measures that have been taken in the United States. For example, the websites in New York State that show parents the air quality in children's schools in their individual classrooms, because over there they seem to be able to measure such things and report them back to the parents. You know a bit more about the mitigation measures and pandemic management that's been coming out of Asia. This is a part of the world where the pandemic began, of course, so they've had a shorter learning curve, all things considered. How does our response in the UK stack up to what they've been doing?
Well, I think, thank you, by the way, nice to see you all. I just think that we've been, ever since this all started, we've been a little bit behind the curve. Compared to what was going on in Asia, there was a faster recognition of the airborne channel. Whereas over here, we were it took us quite some time to recognise that it was actually the most common route of transmission. I mean, I ask people to think about, how often have you been to the gym? How often have you been to places where you suddenly catch a cold, especially, around about September time when everybody goes back to school? People like us who've been solving problems of these sorts of things for many, many years prior to this pandemic. We've always known that there's been an airborne issue with this. So I actually started writing to Boris Johnson about it immediately in March. So we saw a recognition of that in other parts of the world a little bit faster than we did here. So I think that, I think it would be without being nasty about it, I think that, we could be described as being a bit slow to react. And then my view on it is that we've been rather reactionary since then in terms of how things have developed for the actual official guidance. If I may give a little bit more detail on that, what we've ended up with in terms of guidance are mitigations which, do provide some benefit. Let's be clear about this. Okay, ventilation air change increases are effective at dealing with airborne contaminants, because what ventilation is, it's a dilution and displacement process. And it's been, we always use increased ventilation to help with problems. If you've got smells, you open a window. If you're worried about things that might be in the air, carbon monoxide from cooking, you open a window. These things we've always done. And then obviously some of the other methods, which purification methods I'll come on to later. But the thing about this is that my opinion of just putting ventilation as the primary mitigation for viruses, I've always been rather at odds with that, because a dilution and displacement process on something that if you ingest it, if it's been blown around, can still kill you. That's not really as safe a process as one that might kill the virus as soon as possible after it's emitted from your mouth, if you breathe it out or sing it out or talk it out, whatever, or if you touch it onto a surface. And when I mentioned just now, I started writing to the government about this in March. The subject matter of my first letter was exactly this topic. We're in a situation where we have a real potential problem on our hands, and there are things out there that will actually give this level of mitigation. And I was quite frustrated that we weren't listened to. So I think that, in summary, it's been we've been a bit slow to react, and then obviously we've been we haven't shown, in my opinion, we haven't shown leadership when there was a golden opportunity to show leadership in this. And obviously, big verticals like schools and healthcare, we're still living with this right now.
Yeah, I mean, when you want leadership, you want somebody to actually take control of this situation, a global pandemic, and how it affects people in this country. We couldn't really have wished for a worse response, quite frankly. I mean, yeah, I think you've been quite polite to the government, quite frankly. They've been behind the curve for the whole of the pandemic. There's an argument for saying that they've actually ignored it to a degree by just believing that if we all catch it, everything will be fine. So it's not all that surprising that perhaps they've not taken the measures that you might well have advised them on, surely.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting point too, right? Because if you remember, when this first started in March, I think it was 23rd of March, wasn't it? The first lockdown was announced. The prevailing talk at the time was it would all blow over by summer. I remember one of our big projects, for our business is Lloyd's of London. It's the insurance market in the city, and they made contact with us at around that time, and they were kind of like saying exactly that. So I mean, I on the one hand I'm critical, but on the other hand I'm also I like to empathise. I mean, who on earth would like to have been in a position like this in these sort of like unprecedented situation? But if I may say this. My personal opinion, is that decision making. I think too much, decision making capability has been put in one area, into perhaps the scientific community, and in a way, it's almost like, right, well, you guys tell us what's going on. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing completely, but what I am saying is that. It's all well and good as long as what you're getting is absolutely the best advice possible. And I think that people like myself who've got a lot of experience, whereas people who are in the scientific community perhaps don't have the sort of experience that we have. I'm not sure how much of that sort of experience has been given the opportunity to contribute to help this matter. And some of the things that I'll talk about today, I think maybe people may not have even heard of before. This is what I'm saying. I mean, we've been solving these problems like this for a long time. So, my relationship with the technology provider that's, that for our unique air purification predates this pandemic. We've been doing this for years. We didn't need this pandemic to be able to help. And, from my personal perspective, there is a degree of frustration with that. I'm a member of the Indoor Environments Group, which comprises people like Stephen Holgate, Kath Noakes, who's a prominent SAGE member, and others, very, very serious people in the indoor air quality industry, and real great people. I must say. I mean, I feel very, sort of honoured when I go to these meetings, a few meetings. But I must also say, I suppose, when you empathise, if people are given responsibility, it kind of changes things too. There's a very interesting article recently that kind of like sees both sides of the fence. So I think from my personal perspective, the way it's played out, I actually, I can understand from the scientific community's perspective. I think that if it was my choice, I would have organised it slightly different, and I would have used scientific input, but I would have made more of the decision making myself and my group. That's how I would have done it.
Can I just come in there and say,
yeah, sure, Sarah.
What you just described there describes a lot of the approach to the pandemic, obviously not just towards ventilation. There is a reliance on scientists, which is absolutely fantastic, and I'm agreeing with bringing them in. But there are industry experts who are doing this on a daily basis. We saw that we're seeing that with what's coming out with the PPE debacle that the Good Law Project are showing. There's an awful lot of industry experts which have just been ignored. People who are doing this thing, whether it is producing PPE for specific settings, that were totally ignored and bypassed with the procurement. And that seems to have happened or be happening again still with industry experts in ventilation, who you're doing it on a daily basis. You have clients, you have customers who are asking you to solve their problems. You are going in and doing it, and your expertise, I'm not saying is ignored, though sometimes it does feel ignored. I think sometimes it's just bypassed. Oh, we'll just go back to the theory and the science and the academic without the real how it works in practice. And we see that from the school's point of view as parents. Come and ask the parents how sending your child to school and the interactions that happen within a school day and everything work. Ask the teachers who are teaching in those settings. Don't always just say, oh, we have this education czar who thinks this is how schools run, because it's not the reality. That's what it is on paper, but the reality is asking those people who are living with that lived experience. And I think very much so that's happened with ventilation.
A lot of the education czars have not been in a classroom, or if they have, not for a very, very long time. I'm in a strange position. So I'm both a parent and a former teacher, and we could have listed 20 reasons why you need to sort out the ventilation in school from the very beginning, from when you first start teaching and you get sick every winter for about 5 years, or just looking at when, I mean, I've worked in schools where they've been drafty Victorian schools, which is one set of problems, and when they update them and they're hermetically sealed schools, there's a completely different set of problems. And you could see all this coming, but they didn't ask people like you or teachers, as Sarah said, or parents who know exactly how grubby children are and where they get. They asked people who are quite distant from this.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. Very, very soon after the pandemic was the lockdown, the first lockdown was announced, I'd written to the government. We didn't get a reply, and myself and my wife, we went to the office of the DHSC at 39 Victoria Street, wherever it is, Matt Hancock's office, and I marched in there and I said, right, I'm not leaving here until somebody, you know, and either I see Mr. Hancock or I'm you know, and I really.
We now know he's busy doing something else.
Yeah, I mean, I basically said, look, we really can help here, and I, you know, we've come here, we want to leave our details, we want to talk to somebody, you know, we can really help. And we went from there to the Elephant and Castle, to NHS Improvement, where Sir Simon Stevens is located, and we went from there to City Hall, where I wanted to try and see if I could see Sadiq Khan, and then I went from there to TfL. Okay, now with the exception of a gentleman whose name I can't remember, but he was a real star. He was a senior fellow in the NHS who heard me just talking to the receptionist, and he suddenly appeared out from behind this thing saying, well, you're unlikely to get to see anybody there, but if you leave me your card, I will do what I can, because I think what you've said is interesting. But I didn't get anybody coming back to me, I must say, from the DHSC. I didn't get anybody coming back to me either from TfL. I had a couple of the usual type of emails coming back from City Hall people. And you know, it was kind of like dismissive. Thanks very much. You know, we'll deal with it. You know, we know what we're doing. And of course, okay, I was like, okay, well, that's kind of like early on in the piece. But when I look at how things have played out, and I'm absolutely certain that, as you just said here, it's kind of like almost like reading from a book. There's very little actual experience that's contributing to what's being actually done. You know, in the field, so either in buildings or in transportation, this sort of thing. And there are, like I said at the very beginning of this, it's not that everything's wrong. It's just that there are better ways that may not compromise our long-term plans for energy efficiency, for example, or will not compromise those. You know, when we do our job, you know, we kind of like have a mind for all these things, and we're kind of used to it, you know, and you know, we really do have, or our solutions, if you like, take care of all these things, whereas many of these suggestions that we're seeing at the moment, you may get some mitigation. It's not the best mitigation, but you're going to compromise all the things that we've been doing in the last 15 years to make buildings more energy efficient. And obviously, if you make buildings less energy efficient, what does that impact? It impacts health, well-being, and productivity, and that is going to affect everybody in our schools as well. You know, so I've been arguing these things every time I go and talk to have a strategic presentation. I've been doing it for years. I mean, anybody who does my job in this industry, these are the outcomes that you're looking to try and get people to buy into when somebody wants to think about a ventilation solution. Our business has always been problem solving. So rather than spec, we'll wait for the phone to ring. Hello, I've got a problem with mold. Hello, I've got a problem with condensation. Hello, I'm worried about breathing in VOCs. Or my son's got, or daughter has got COPD. I'm worried about that, you know. And obviously more recently, we're very worried about COVID. Can you help us? And you know, we solve these problems, you know. And all we've wanted to do ever since this started is help, you know. And we really can help, because this is what we do, and our systems work, our solutions work, you know.
Yeah, just as with the scientists, you are an advisor. You're offering advice, you're offering your expertise, and of course scientists identified that this was an airborne virus. Scientists warned the government against doing things like opening up for Christmas, or go out to help, eat out to help out, and things like that. Scientists and advisors such as yourselves, all you can do is offer your advice and offer your recommendations. Unfortunately, none of them have any place in policy making, and if the government chooses to ignore that, as they seem to have consistently done, then that's just what they're going to do, and we end up in the situation we're in now. And of course, as you said, we were in denial. Well, you know, Asian countries were dealing with COVID as an airborne virus, we were not treating it as such. We were not accepting that it was being passed on by droplets in the air or coming into contact with contaminated surfaces that people had coughed or sneezed onto. And while they were taking this seriously, here we were donning masks. We were encouraged to wash our hands and just social distance, the whole hands, face and space campaign. But this campaign highlighted the issue of an airborne contagion. Yes, it started to educate people about it. Yes, eventually. But now our kids are due to return to school. They already have in some areas. The messaging now is no more masks, no more social distancing, just a bit of hand gel. And it's like we've gone back to before we believed it was airborne again.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if anybody has told the virus it has to walk from now on. What do you think of the current government messaging? Because to call it confused might be a bit kind.
Right. So look, everything that you just said is absolutely precise. I mentioned I've written to the government. I wrote to the government the first time in March. I've probably written about 4 or 5 letters, and all those letters, by the way, are on our website if people want to see them. But I'm not trying to blow my own trumpet, but I predicted the second wave and I predicted the third one. And the reason I gave in my letters was that none of the mitigations that have been introduced are killing this virus as quickly as possible. Okay, if you improve or increase ventilation air changes, you're just blowing it around. Okay, yes, it may well blow out the window, but it also may well blow into somebody else's mouth. Okay, ventilation, the messaging that's been given on ventilation air change increases is it will just blow out the window. Well, I'm sorry, but it does not work like that. Ventilation is an essential process for buildings. Let's be clear about this. And there are some ventilation strategies that underperform in production, and British buildings are notorious for that, especially the ones that have natural background ventilation in their strategies. And of course, many schools are like that. But the fact is that if ventilation air change increases are your primary mitigation, as soon as you stop physical segregation of people in a lockdown process where literally they can breathe out the virus, but it's not going to transmit because there's no one else in close proximity. As soon as you relax from that and you're not killing this virus straight away, the R rate will start to jump. So the content of my letters was that you will see the R rate increase if you relax lockdown without a process like photohydroionization, our technology here. Okay, and from my point of view, you know, where we are right at this moment in time, I think that this is part of my motivation to come onto your platform, because I personally am extremely concerned. I must also say that I fully appreciate and understand the pragmatic desire as well to get the country moving. I do appreciate that. We do have vaccines. It's a great thing that we have that. But this virus, I think in my letters back in January, I was saying that there's no guarantee that the vaccines are going to stop transmission, and transmission must be controlled. There are vulnerable people in society. There are all sorts of young people who may, you know, all sorts of age groups actually who may or may not get the vaccine. And to assume that the population is going to get to herd immunity and therefore we don't worry about it, which I think is one of the primary logics in the thinking, I think is I don't want to be rude, but I think that there's plenty of evidence to suggest that you perhaps need to be doing as much as you possibly can. Okay, so this again, where we're trying to contribute. Do you mind if I just go into the differences between, you know, ventilation and then?
I was just going to say, I mean, when people think about ventilation, we're probably thinking of a big vent in the window or in the side wall, and it sort of either sucks air out or blows air in.
Yeah.
You're saying it's more complicated than that, so perhaps it would benefit.
Yeah, so let me, if I may, I want to try and keep this high level. But firstly, it's the process, right? So you want to try and, I think we all agree that the safest way of dealing with viral transmission is to kill it as soon as possible after it comes out of your mouth, or as soon as it's possible after it's put onto a surface. If there's a technology out there that can achieve that, that must be safer than relying on the live virus to be blown around the room and blown out of a window or into a filter or close enough to a UV source to be killed. And I don't want to go into detail about the limitations of filtration or ventilation or UV, but they're all what we call passive processes, okay? And it's not that they don't work, it's just that they're not as effective as what is this process that I'm describing, in which we can use a single word called active. And there is actually a technology out there that's thoroughly tested, proven, that will do exactly this. I mean, it's installed in schools, hospitals, hospitals that use it, the acquired infection rate drops through the floor. Schools that use it, the absentee rate drops down. I mean, these are known feedbacks from schools. And basically the issue with ventilation in our country, I mentioned it earlier, is that what you firstly must do with every single building is look at the ventilation strategy it was built with. In Britain at the moment, there are 4 main strategies, and then there's a 5th section called the alternates. Okay. Now, the way that pretty much all building works is that when you give a building company a job to do, they generally tend to choose the cheapest method of compliance because they're profit-driven organizations. And in the domestic sector, the cheapest method is opening windows, trickle vents, or air bricks. It's called System 1. So you put extractor fans in the wet rooms, in the bathroom, kitchen, and then you put these trickle vents or air bricks or just windows, right? So you get your background ventilation, your supply ventilation, by either blowing through the trickles or opening a few windows. And that's the predominant strategy for domestic properties because they're all profit driven when they build them. Okay, and why would a builder, spend £2,000 when he can spend £200, if you get my point, right? That's what they do. Okay, so you have millions and millions of buildings in Britain that have System 1. Okay, in the commercial sector, it's not quite the same thing. In the commercial sector, you see a lot more ducted HVAC systems, centralized HVAC systems. So this is where, when people use the term, ventilation needs to be improved, it's not necessarily the case. What you need to understand is the ventilation strategy of each property. Now, in the schools and education sector, there are numerous buildings in Britain that used to be residential. So in other words, the ventilation strategy that they have, okay, is based on what it was originally built for, okay, System 1. And then you also see remote classrooms and so on. And basically, in the vast majority of school buildings in Britain, the supply ventilation aspect of their strategy is coming from natural means. Okay, that's the first piece. The second piece is, during the summer, we don't really worry about this, okay, apart from people who might suffer a bit from hay fever, okay? People tend to open windows because in our climate, we tend to have quite warm summers, and of course it's getting warmer, isn't it? Yeah. So you don't really worry about ventilation or the consequence or problems of insufficient ventilation because you just don't see them, okay? You don't see condensation and mold growth. You don't smell lingering odors in many buildings. So a lot of the time, depending on the time of year that you're assessing your problem, if you're doing it at the wrong time of year, you might think, I've looked at the building in the middle of July, there's not a problem here. And then you sail off to do something else, and then along comes winter and you've got a problem again. The reason being is because the ventilation strategy is not necessarily having to perform during summer, but the moment the winter comes along and you shut those windows, and then suddenly the performance of the ventilation is utterly reliant on the strategy, that's where all the problems come. So in Britain, in millions of homes, you start seeing mold and condensation growth, okay, which of course can contribute to poor health, asthma, and so on, because dust mite populations start to increase. These are facts that we've been living with in this country since the early 70s, okay? When the oil crisis happened, the wholesale cost of energy rose, we started double glazing to save energy, okay? And suddenly we started to see mold and condensation. And some great minds in British Gas got together and came up with this idea of using air pushed into the house to dilute and displace the humidity buildup from the occupancy, from breathing, cooking, showering, and all the moisture producing habits, okay, that's going to keep that relative humidity down at levels where mold and condensation can't happen. It worked, and it spawned a massive industry today. There are millions of systems with solutions that have been retrofitted into existing buildings to improve the performance of the background ventilation. Now, this is so relevant for schools because right now, I've heard it numerous times. I'll go into the school, you can just open a window, even if it's in winter, just open a window, everything's going to be fine. That may be true, it may not be true as well, but when you do that, you are allowing heat to escape. You're going to increase pollution ingress, you're going to make people cold. That's going to affect their concentration, which of course you don't want in a school. What you really want is, firstly, protection against this deadly virus. Secondly, you need sufficient ventilation processes so as you don't have any of the other consequences of insufficient ventilation. So CO2 buildup. CO2 monitors have a purpose in that regard. But let's also be clear, in schools, we also need to be monitoring things like particulate levels. Okay? Anybody suffers hay fever, people can have serious attacks from that. Roadside traffic pollution, the very subject of that young lady, Ella Kissy Deborah, terrible, terrible tragedy. Okay, but she basically had numerous asthma attacks, all brought on by particulate pollution.
I was about to say, in a
schools.
school in central London, if you open the window, you would literally choke to death. I went to school just off Victoria Street, and you wouldn't want to open a window. It's practically impossible in a lot of city centres to do that.
Exactly. You know, so the point is that ventilation is important. At the moment, the guidance is to increase ventilation to blow away COVID. And when you do that, obviously you get all these consequential problems of making people cold and so on, because the COVID mitigation is part of the ventilation. Now, the way we've been doing it is we actually separate the two. So we have a process, a technical process, that actually gives a far safer and more effective mitigation against COVID because it kills it at the point of transmission. So the moment it's issued into the air, it's destroyed straight away. But it's not reliant on ventilation. So you don't need a ventilation process. Obviously, if you have a naturally ventilated space, our units have little fans in them that create the air movement for it. So basically, we have a process that's not reliant on ventilation. And therefore, with our solutions, with this process happening, ventilation rates become a matter purely of compliance. You need to just have sufficient ventilation. Let's go back to what I was just saying there. During the winter months, I think one of you mentioned there earlier that there was a study done to show that many schools had poor ventilation rates during winter. Well, that's not surprising because many of them are naturally ventilated, rely on natural ventilation. So the solution to that is to increase the ventilation rate, have a process that have the best protection against COVID, but something that the ventilation just needs to be increased without any of the consequential problems. And we've been doing this for 10 years. There are the retrofit ventilation strategy that I mentioned, the one that's been installed in millions of domestic homes, can quickly and easily be fitted into pretty much every school. And you will get an ability to ventilate every schoolroom without ever needing to open a window during the colder months of the year. So all of the air that comes in is filtered, it's protected. You have the separated protection against COVID. I like HEPA filters, but only for what they were designed to do, which is get rid of particulate pollution. HEPAs in schools which have high risk of particulate pollution ingress, when somebody will open a window, because they will, even with the best ventilation. So these things have a place, but it takes the experience to know precisely what to do about it. And you know, I mean, I've heard people talk about using the ducted strategies of Part F, you know, the ventilation regulations, so MVHR, the heat recovery methods, or even MEVs. Well, those two methods were not designed for retrofitting, firstly, and obviously there may be some properties where it may be suitable, but the retrofit input ventilation process that we use, we've installed in thousands of homes ourselves, and similar sorts of buildings and a number of commercials, and it always works. Our metric as to whether there's whether we've got a happy customer is, do we ever hear from them again? And we don't hear from them again, you know.
Well, that generally does indicate that you've kind of solved the problem. So we've identified these problems, this airborne virus, and you've identified a number of solutions that you would advise that they look at. But the government, as ever, will say it'll be too much money. We can't afford it. It's what they always say. And we know it's a nonsense, because as anybody who appreciates the fact that we print our own currency will know, it actually comes down to political will and whether they want to do something. They've actually shown in the US by injecting billions into mitigation measures in their schools to try and to fix some of the things that you've spoken about this evening. I understand there's some interesting trials in Bradford and Scotland happening at the moment, but schools have already returned in Scotland, and the Bradford ones were mentioned briefly by Sarah and Claire's SafeEd colleague Lisa Diaz last week, and I'll put her very salient point to you as well. Why, 18 months into a pandemic, are we running trials and not implementing measures? And are the measures being trialed actually any good?
Yeah, well, firstly, I don't know all the detail. All I can do is tell you that I'm monitoring what's happening. I think that it's probably accurate to say that not all of the methodologies are being tested in that trial. I mean, I can't say it for certain, but I think that you'll find that
sensors are testing in Bradford, isn't it, Sarah?
I think no, they've got 30 schools involved. 10 will have no intervention. 10 will have HEPA filtration techniques, and 10 will have some kind of purification technique.
Sometimes, yes, that's what I read.
Yeah, the trials will go on to next year, but we'll get further details. I've submitted the Freedom of Information request. We're asked for all details, so tell us how it was decided, how it's going to run, what the measures are, who's doing the measurements, how it's going to be implemented, where the results are going to be published. We've asked for all that, so hopefully within 20 days we'll get that information.
I think it's quite likely that the testing or the units that are being selected for this are going to meet the sort of like the explicit mention items in the existing guidance, in which case they're all passive technologies, right? Now that therefore, remember what I said, you know, what you want is the best process for the problem that you've got. The best process for a virus is to kill it straight away. And passives, they will give you some protection, let's be clear about that, but you're not getting that real-time elimination. It's impossible to get that with any passive measure. Okay, and obviously with photohydroionization, it can be achieved. You know, so I think that without knowing all the details, obviously we would love to have our technology part of this. I might add, you know, and actually talking about that, we've got some calls next week with some universities who've been on to us about this. So you know, watch this space, I suppose, is the message there. I mean, like I said, it's not that the whole objective with this process should not be looking for what's the best one. There isn't a best one. What one needs to be doing is understanding what each one is actually doing, okay? And then you can compare within that process. But each one of these things is doing something beneficial is the way to think about it. And what you really want is the best process for the problem that you have. And when you come to deadly viruses where you want to get rid of those as quickly as possible, I'm sorry, but passive measures are not the most effective measures unless you have something that kills it in real time, and that's what we have. You know, there's something else too, if I may, real quick,
yeah, sure.
Is that we're hearing a lot of talk about CO2 monitoring. Okay, so CO2 monitoring it's always been a proxy for whether a place is well ventilated or not. Obviously, if you just have a CO2 monitor, it shows you high levels. That means everybody's already asleep, if you get my point. You know. So I think that obviously there's a big, strong argument for just looking at, you know, surveying buildings, looking at the strategy, and people like us will be able to tell you if you're going to get a problem in winter. But I think that there's something else that needs to be done. You mentioned earlier about in America, what the monitoring they have over there. There are technologies here in Britain that allow you to monitor all sorts of, you know, cost-effective technologies as well, that allow you to monitor all sorts of things in addition to CO2. And that data can be published on the web, so you can interrogate it in real time on the school's intranet. Parents can log in and see it. And those technologies can even be used to control ventilation systems and other things. And these are technologies that we resell right now. We have customers buying these things from us. And again, I'll go back to what I said earlier. I hear the thing about CO2 monitoring, but why wasn't industry consulted? Because there's much more effective, better ways to spend that money and get more information, probably for the same amount that you're spending, you know, and this is where we could have really contributed, I think, to that.
The other question is the action, isn't it? I mean, okay, it says there's high CO2. Are the children actually going to be spending half the winter in the playground?
Yes, exactly.
Well, as far as, you know, government contracting and how they decide then, there's been plenty said in recent weeks, especially here, about how they decide they're going to award their contracts. But you know, CO2 monitors, as valid as they may be and as interesting as the results may be for parents, they don't actually fix anything. They just tell you what the levels are in the school. They're not a mitigation measure in and of themselves. They're an information source, sure, but they've got to be used in conjunction with actually doing something about this. And you know, you mentioned that different buildings, everyone's different. Essentially, everyone needs a different kind of mitigation measure that would best suit their needs. Bespoke measures, because essentially buildings have been repurposed over the years, not necessarily schools particularly, but of course it's not schools that are just affected. I mean, I'm thinking of care homes off the top of my head, and the way that people have actually been sent back into care homes that may have all these ventilation and airflow measures and problems that you've already discussed. You mentioned the photohydronization process. I hope I pronounced that right. Could you explain in a little more detail how that actually works and why it's different than your standard ventilation?
Sure. Well, okay, so photohydroionization is the actual term. Okay, I say it rather rapidly. But the first thing to say about this particular technology, okay, is that it was invented in the late 1990s. It's actually been around for years, and it has millions of users all around the world, okay? It's a patented process. It's a photocatalytic process. It's a very unique process. And it's used in homes, offices, schools, healthcare, public transport, warehousing, the military, the government, you name it, it's used all over the place. A bit of brief background. It first came to prominence in the United States, where it was invented by the manufacturers whose name is RGF Environmental. They basically are a 35-year-old innovator and manufacturer. They offered air purification from the outset. They used to offer ozone generators. People started realizing the problem of ozone in the 90s. It can scar the lungs. And RGF wanted to create a zero ozone replacement all that time ago. And that's what they did. It got its first outing in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, when Sandia National Labs was called in by the Department of Homeland Security. They were worried about bioterrorism on airliners. And RGF presented photohydroionization as something that could kill a virus that could be aerated on an airliner before it even reaches the filters. Okay, that was the presentation. They were asked to prove it. They invented a nebulizer. Well, they created a nebulizer to prove the concept, achieved a 99% reduction. This is back in 2001. And, you know, the rest is history. 2 years later, the Chinese government ordered thousands of units for the SARS outbreak, the original one. And, you know, if you fast forward to where we are today, RGF, about a year ago, they did some testing with a California-based company called Innovative Bioanalysis, which still has no precedent in any public health or academic research, to prove what I call the environmental effects, the fact that the process is happening throughout the entire space at the same time. So they had to design a new protocol for that. So basically what it does is it destroys viral emissions and VOCs and odors, okay, where they are, okay, both in the air and on surfaces. So it's a process that infiltrates into the air. It creates an equilibrium throughout an entire airspace. And anything that's introduced into the air after the equilibrium is established, whether it be in the one corner of the room or the other or anywhere in between, because it fills the entire airspace, is subject to that immediate treatment. And that's my point. You could fill a room with 30 children. And, you know, let's talk about this for a second, right? COVID is one thing. What about the common cold? What about flu? What about all the other things that we kind of forgotten about to a certain extent? What about the norovirus? You know, for bacteria on surfaces. I mean, you know, we've already mentioned this. You know, schools are great hotbeds for all these sorts of things, which ultimately affects the productivity of them and possibly their teachers. These types of processes, okay, is unique. You do not get this capability with a filtration process or ventilation or anything else. It just works in a different way. You know, so that's kind of how it works. It gives you this real-time unique protection. It's very, very safe. You know, more than 5 million installs over 20 years, never ever a safety issue in a massive litigious society like America. You know, there's no safety concerns with it.
I find this incredible. This is a 30-year-old proven technology, and I've never heard of it. 20
years old.
Well, 20 odd. Shall we split the difference? It's around a while, as you said. It's proven technology.
Definitely in 2 Canadian schools. I know I read some research. It's been implemented in 2 Canadian schools.
Oh well, this technology is used in thousands of schools. There's more than 5 million installs around the world. RGF sells into 80 countries. We are RGF's master distributor into Britain. Okay. Now, right now, at this very moment, there is a test going on in Ontario, Canada, that has 250 schools signed up to it. That's happening right now. I actually know the chief executive of the company providing the RGF technology to that project. So that's 250 schools. Something like 112,000 students and teachers are being covered by that process, and this is currently happening. It's like I said, it's used in numerous schools and healthcare facilities, not just in North America, but Latin America, Asia, and so on. And obviously, we're seeing a large, the take up we're getting in Britain now is increasing rapidly at the same time. Yeah, but it's very, very good. I mean, some of the anecdotal feedback from Chicago public schools, for example, is one of the ones on the RGF website. They have a documented huge drop in absentee rates in the schools once it's been deployed. Because if you think about it, what it's doing is it's stopping all sorts of things from being ingested by us. Right now, all of us right now, if your building is naturally ventilated, okay, and most properties in Britain are, then especially during winter, you're not going to see effective dilution displacement. That's why we all tend to catch illnesses over winter. It's been like it for years. My business, we retrofit ventilation, air change, increase improvements to stop that. That's why the problems go away. But this process destroys the things. So they can't be, if they are ingested, they're not going to do anything to you anyway, So it really, really has this enormously beneficial effect on productivity and absenteeism. The anecdotal feedback just shows that,
I just find it incredible that this technology has been around so long. It could effectively get schools back to normal, as everybody wants. The biggest drivers of infection in this country of COVID, and we've never heard of it. And I'm not hearing anything from the government saying, although you're saying that take-up in this country is increasing rapidly, I've heard nothing from any government official to say that this is something they're even looking at. Are they shunning this or embracing it?
We actually, my company, my relationship with RGF goes back to 2018, and in the last 12 months, we have 2 PR companies. I've spoken to all sorts of MPs and lords myself, and if you read Hansard, if you go onto Hansard online and do a search of photohydroionization, you will see some of our efforts have actually got to the point where we've managed to get it mentioned in there. But this is why I started writing to Boris Johnson back in March last year. It's not through hard, us not trying. You know what I mean? We've always known that this is a real the solution really to this problem. And let me also just reiterate. Remember, because it's detached from ventilation, you get this much more effective and safer process of COVID mitigation, any viral mitigation, that does not penalise energy efficiency, health and well-being, or productivity, because you're not increasing the ventilation. And you only need to increase the ventilation if the building's ventilation strategy is underperforming, but that is detached from COVID protection. Do you see what I mean? So, buildings should be properly ventilated anyway. Many of them underperform, we know that, but this is where all this, it's kind of clouded, and the guidance kind of like, it's all a bit of a mishmash. But our method of dealing with these things is very, very clear, and it works. It really works. We're providing solutions these days where we make a ventilation air change increase improvement to a property that's naturally ventilated, and we integrate this technology into our ventilation products, so they get both things at the same time. It really, our systems work. We put one of these, by the way, into the Samaritans here at Reigate recently. A number of domestic properties. We have. I must say, I love doing this job because I say I hardly ever hear from the customers apart from the thanks that we get. And people, when we solve somebody's mold problem, when people call you and tell you, thanks, I've had this for years. It really, oh my God, it's so worthwhile doing. And all we want to do is help. And I really, really believe that the prize is not just protection, it's improvement of society, because our schools are the start of everything for the next generation. If we can help them, by making the air that they're breathing better, it's going to be good for all of us, the whole country. And I think that if you look at how schools are ventilated in places like America, they're all ducted supply. They all have better air change rates than we do for this reason. So I think that, much of the stuff that's being said by the guidance is correct, but it's how the detail about how you go about it is where people like me really can contribute to this. Wow. And photohydroionization should be a staple part of every building going forward. Now that we've had this COVID pandemic, and this virus will be with us, we want these protections in the microbial category for all of our building spaces going forward.
As we said the other week, it will be a legacy benefit. You improve these things in schools. You're not doing something bad. It's not something you're going to have to take out when all this is finished. It's something that will be a continual improvement to schools. Yes. Yet people still seem to be against these kind of improvements. Yeah,
I mean, I could go. You're right. I could go on about this. That a lot of people have concerns about things like byproducts because it's an additive process. I actually was on the call yesterday with RGF. I've got some pretty serious meetings with them, with some pretty serious entities, shall we say, in Britain next week. And I asked them about the byproducts because obviously they've got the same issues going on in America. Remember, RGF is a 35-year-old company, been doing this for years. And one has to remember that right now, if you go outside right now, okay, you will be breathing in between 35 and 50 parts per billion ozone right now, every single one of us. If you go outside, you'll be breathing in between 0.01 and 0.04 parts per million hydrogen peroxide right now. And if you do anything in your house, if you had a VOC meter right now, you'll be breathing in a lot of VOCs, especially if you're naturally ventilated property. We've been doing these things for years. These technologies may, I was told by one of the guys at RGF yesterday, may well produce certain byproducts, but in the parts per trillion range, so minute that it's not going to have any effect, and it's just a VOC that you're probably breathing in anyway. So these are the things one has to keep these things in context. And remember, I always go back to this: more than 5 million installs, never ever a safety issue. We run photohydroionization over there in this house. We've got one over there and one upstairs. Okay. 3 years, never had any colds, flu, anything. In fact, on the week before the lockdown, I was convinced I had this thing. I did about 60 social housing surveys in central London. And I came back into this living room, that thing over there, I sat close to it for, from Friday night through to Sunday, all of the symptoms that I had disappeared. And yes, I know he's bound to say that, of course he is. But the fact is that all the anecdotal feedback, we had a woman speak to us in February. She said, I'm sorry, I hope you don't mind this anecdote, I'll give it to you. She said, I'm a vulnerable person. My son, who's out right now, has just been diagnosed with COVID. And I think your products might be able to help me. She said, I don't open windows, I can't afford it. This was in February when it was freezing. Okay. So we got one of our standalone units across to her. These, like this, by the way. One of these, 1,000 square feet. Okay, one of these will do a whole classroom, just one of those. Anyway, we got the unit over to her, okay? I said to her son hadn't got back yet, okay? She said that she lives there with him and another son. It's a ground floor terraced house in Clare Road in Hounslow, this one. Anyway, 3 days later, she rings back and says, right, my son's COVID symptoms have all gone. She said, my other son, who's had asthma for 5 years, all of his symptoms have all gone, okay? And this is remarkable. And we obviously said, well, delighted to hear it, just carry on, don't change any of your habits, just make sure you don't turn the unit off, etc. He calls us back after 30 days, saying that they'd all had 5 COVID tests since we last spoke. Her son, who had COVID, that's all ancient history, and she was just screaming from the rooftops, and she hadn't opened one window in that whole time. Okay. Now, this is just yet another anecdote. This technology works, it's safe. And when I hear these things, that's where I get frustrated because, I've been trying to get this into the mainstream for the benefit of all of us, We know it's safe. I've had people say to me things like, well, it might produce byproducts. And my point to them is, well, where's the evidence that it does? We've got loads of evidence that says that it does work. It may well produce tiny, minuscule, irrelevant amounts of thing. I don't know. But when you've never had a safety issue, why can't you recognise that? I find people arguing in an imbalanced manner, and obviously we just want I think this is an opportunity for all of our health to take a step forward. And of course, if we can achieve that, remember the amount of money that the government, whoever the government may be in the future, spends on the NHS could drop. We could stop having to spend money on these illnesses. If we're reducing acquired infections, if the amount of people going to hospital with illnesses reduces because we've got this type of technology running in homes and schools and workplaces, these are the wins that are up on offer here with this sort of technology, I think.
Yeah, the savings involved will absolutely pay for themselves going forward with the cost savings involved in illness and what have you.
You're quite right.
I am sorry, we are out of time. We've reached our hour, unfortunately, Andrew. Please do keep us informed as to how things develop and how you are finding things with the government and your contacts there and the meetings you're having. We would absolutely love to hear some updates from you, hopefully some positive ones, as people will start to look up and take notice of the technology that you've got and how effective it would be in combating this COVID pandemic and actually getting life back to normal again for real, rather than just words and sticking plasters.
Well, look, I mean, we'll certainly do that. I'll make myself available for any meeting like this. What you guys are doing is really great and noble, and we here will do whatever we can to support you. I think it's brilliant, and carry on. And thank you so much for asking me to contribute. I'm absolutely delighted, and I hope that you will ask me to come on again.
Absolutely, we will. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you, Sarah and Claire, as well. We will catch you on the next